with all these warnings about the pluses and minuses of the data, let me show you some of the stories that I think are more or less true and try to interpret them. First of all, in case you had any doubt, the recession that started in December of 2007 and that then dramatically accelerated in the fall of 2008 is by far the worst in our lifetime. I mean, really by far. And here's my attempt to show that. This shows for the U.S. as a whole, not for Michigan. This shows for the U.S. as a whole the trajectory of employment in the last 4 recessions. We have, as I said, good monthly data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so each of these dots is a monthly employment carried out for 48 months, in other words, for 4 years after the onset of that recession. And so here you have on the horizontal axis months from 1 to 48. And then on this axis you've got, this is employment as a percentage of the employment that you had at the start. So at the start, each one of these 4 lines starts at 100%, and then because it's a recession, then they go down. And in the deep recession of the early 80s, which if you were in Michigan, you know that the early 80s was a really tough time. We had a sharp downturn and then a quite strong recovery. Then in the early 90s, we had a not very steep downturn and then a decent recovery. And then in 11 years ago, we had a not very steep downturn, but then when the economy began to grow again, the job market didn't. And we had 2 years, 2002 through the end of 2003, of what we called the jobless recovery. And then finally, a sluggish recovery. Okay, here's what we've just come out of. And 48 months, that gets you to November of last year. So that's, and the trend has sort of continued slowly upward since then. Notice that they're almost identical for the first 10 months. And then where's month 10? I think it's that one. What's that? That's Lehman Brothers. And it's sort of like we had a financial heart attack. We, in the early part of the 21st century, we in America, for better or worse, we gobbled down every cheeseburger and fries that we could get, and we thought we never had a heart attack. But we had a heart attack, and we know exactly when it struck. It went beep, 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 at 1:45 in the morning on Monday, September 15th, 2008. That's when Lehman Brothers collapsed. Lehman Brothers by itself wouldn't have caused this massive downturn, but what it did was investors in the interconnected global financial markets said, I thought I could trust Lehman Brothers. They're this icon of Wall Street, been around for 150 years. If I can't trust them, who can I trust? And so the credit markets froze up. And that caused by far the worst financial crisis that we've had in our lifetime. And so you see this rapid downturn. This little upturn, that's the spring 2 years ago, that's census jobs. We are the poster child for the success that comes when you go all into a sector and that sector is booming. And that's what happened in Michigan in the middle decades of the 20th century. From 1940 to 1970, our economy was showing phenomenal economic growth, and 100,000 people a year were flooding into Michigan to take jobs, many of them in the manufacturing sector. Manufacturing hasn't performed as well relatively since then. The shrinkage probably started in the 50s. We have data that we can compare across the 50 states beginning back in 1963. And so this shows manufacturing share of the gross domestic product in the state or in the country. So it's all the dollars originating in manufacturing as a fraction of all the dollars in the entire economy. And you can see that for the US, it's from 28% down to 11 or 12. A very substantial change. That's not always because manufacturing has been shrinking, although sometimes manufacturing has indeed shrunk. But in many of these years, manufacturing grew some, but everything else grew a lot. So it's been a sector in relative decline for a very long time. But if you're Michigan, you're the one state more than any other that stood to lose from that structural change in the national economy and really in the global economy. We've gone from 49% down to, in recent years, 16 or 17. We've actually had a little bit of a rebound in manufacturing in the last 2 years, and I'm okay with that. It's added tens of thousands of jobs. But I think we should be honest in saying, sure, we want to maintain manufacturing, but it's never going to be, or at least I don't think any time in the lifetimes of any of us, is it likely to be the dominant force in our economy that it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so we need to try to stimulate manufacturing, but we also need to look for all sorts of other things because, and within manufacturing and within every sector, to the extent that we can be at the top of the skill chain. You know, Michigan, one of our bright spots is that we are the world's center, Southeast Lower Michigan is the world's center for high-tech automotive research. And those are jobs that have really high value. Okay, so far we haven't had a whole lot of good news. But I like to remind people that we're not poor. We've had a lousy decade, but we're not poor. I say that for two reasons. One is keep our head up. The world press, the national press have painted a picture of the Michigan economy, which is of absolute devastation. But we are not Mongolia or Myanmar or Mozambique. We are really, we're much more affluent than we were a generation or two ago. And we're, you know, if you could take almost anybody from Michigan and plunk them down randomly in some place in Asia or Latin America or Africa, they would be the richest person in the village by far. So, you know, part of it is just keep your head up. It's not as bad as it's sometimes portrayed. Okay, you can see that for a lot of this period, the red for Michigan is higher than the black for the U.S. In other words, Michigan had per capita incomes above the national average. That's no longer true. And it can be seen more clearly, I think, if we express Michigan's per capita income as a percentage of the nation's per capita income. And here is that trend going back to 1950. Here's 100. So 100% of the national average, that's the national average. And you can see that we were above the national average in every single year in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then we've been below the national average in most years since then. And fortunately, we finally seem to have bottomed out. We've bottomed out at about 13% below the national average. And in fact, after falling from 21st among the 50 states only 8 years ago, to 37th among the 50 states for these 3 years. Last year, or in 2010, which is the last year for which we have the data, we leapfrogged Tennessee, and now we're 36th. So at least we've bottomed out. We're making some progress. But my guess is that there's not anybody in this room, and here's the black line provides the best statistical fit to the trend, and it's not very pretty. I don't think there's anybody in this room who would really be very happy with that. We'd like to reverse it. That leads immediately to the question, whom should we emulate? Often I hear it said that we should emulate Indiana. Indiana, which is 41st among the 50 states. I'm not saying that the fine people of Indiana, I know some people who live in Indiana, they're nice folks, but I don't think we should emulate people who are poorer than we are. Why should we, I mean, if Indiana, why stop there? Why not go all the way to Mississippi, which is the poorest of the 50 states? So what is the characteristic of the states that have done best? They all have one thing in common, because what's happened in the last 40 years is that it's been a catastrophe for high school dropouts, People with only a high school diploma and nothing more have gone nowhere. Maybe they've managed to keep one nostril above water. And people with a bachelor's degree, or not all people with a bachelor's degree, if your bachelor's is in Sanskrit or Swahili, you may not have good job choices. But if your bachelor's is in all sorts of other things, your incomes have skyrocketed, relatively speaking. And so what is the characteristic of the states that have done best? They are the most highly educated states. So here is exactly the same graph that I just showed you a minute ago for Michigan. And then superimposed upon that is the trend for Massachusetts. Massachusetts is the most highly educated state in the country. They were much more highly educated than we were 50 years ago, but it did not translate into higher incomes for them back then, because back then it was still true that you could show up at Ford's or Generous Motors and the foreman says, "What do you got?" And you say, "I got 2 strong arms and a strong back and I'll show up on time," and you've got upper middle class wages and benefits for the rest of your life. And there's nothing wrong with that. We took advantage of a tremendous burst, and it brought fabulous affluence to a generation or two of Michigan people, and I don't make any apology for that. But the world has changed, and we have not been all that nimble about changing with it. We have remained below the national average in all sorts of measures of educational attainment, and the places like Massachusetts that were at the top of educational attainment, they have really, really benefited, and we have not. Nowadays, their per capita incomes are about 50% higher than ours. Some of that is, okay, housing is more expensive in Boston than in Detroit. But I'm not saying that this is just a paper phenomenon. This is a real thing. Their economy has done a lot better. Here is the scatter diagram. This shows on the horizontal axis the percent of the population with at least a bachelor's degree. So that includes bachelor's, master's, PhD, law degree, MBA. And then on the vertical axis, you've got per capita income. And here's Massachusetts. I told you that Massachusetts had the most highly educated. Not only do they have the highest college attainment, but they're also, in terms of K through 12 test scores, they're often either number 1 or number 2. So even if you only have a high school diploma, you probably have a better education if you're getting that education in Massachusetts than if you're getting it in most other states. Okay, so here's Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Maryland, New York. Then in the Great Lakes region, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, there's Michigan, and this one is Indiana, a little bit below us. Indiana, by the way, has almost caught up with us, but not quite. Okay, so you want to be rich. I think I know how to get rich. Be like Massachusetts. If you want to be poor, West Virginia has got it figured out. West Virginia has the secret, and Mississippi and Arkansas and Kentucky, they've got it figured out. I don't want to be West Virginia is a pretty place, but I want us to be more prosperous, and I think it has a lot to do with the skills level of our education, so of our population. So always in the background, keep that in mind.